Who's your commander?
Good luck.
Equip.
Move to combat.
Resolves.
Now, before you attack
Does
me,
anyone have an answer?
well played.
Good game.
Today I'm trying a crazy thought experiment. I'm going to try and build the most expensive commander deck possible. And that doesn't just mean including every single expensive card. I'm really trying to put together a deck. I just built the cheapest commander deck I could, a $15 Rurk Thar deck. And now I'm trying to skyrocket the price as much as possible while still having it be a relatively playable deck. Why? But also, how? I don't have $19,000 worth of Magic cards. But I do have a fan who's selling most of his top-end cards. I feel like this is something most of us face. He wasn't using the cards, but he could use the money. But here, I have a life pro tip for you when it comes to getting rid of something you really like but you never use. My suggestion is to take a picture of it. I first heard this advice when it came to getting rid of stuffed animals, but it works with anything nostalgic. Taking a picture means that you'll always have the memory of the time when the object was important to you. And in a lot of cases, the thing is much less important than the memory. So this crazy deck tech is kind of helping him. But more importantly, I think it's gonna be silly to make this ridiculous deck tech, but let's get started. The most expensive legendary creature is Angus Mackenzie. So I've decided to make an Angus Mackenzie Moneybags hyper expensive controlling turbo fog deck, so many adjectives. The key strategy of this deck is to control the board until you can amass an army big enough to win. Let's talk about a lot of the individual cards now. So let's get started with the general himself, Angus Mackenzie. It's a white, blue, green for a legendary 2/2, and Angus has an interesting activated ability. Pay that same cost, white, blue, green, and tap Angus, and he will fog the board. Now, one thing that's interesting is that you can't use this on every opponent's turn in multiplayer games because it's a tap ability, which means that we have to be really conservative when we use Angus. First off, let's talk about some general card manipulation. First off, we have original Lorwyn Ponder, give us some great card selection, Time Twister, because we're going to want to recycle a lot of these cards, especially our fogs, and Preordain, again, some of the best card selection in the format. Next, we're going to skip those extra turn spells and move right down to our Planeswalkers, and these Planeswalkers are kind of our win conditions. Both Elspeths are great because they put creature tokens onto the battlefield. These creature tokens block. They can also eventually overcome and take over the game, especially that Elspeth Sun's champion. Let's also talk about some of the other controlling planeswalkers we have. Jace the Mind Sculptor is just kind of expensive and also gives us some card selection, but Tamiyo can shut down problematic permanents. Also, if we can lock down the board long enough, Jace and Tamiyo have game-ending ultimates. Next up, we have two more controlling planeswalkers. Karn Liberated is a great removal spell, -3 to exile any permanent, and Ugin the Spirit Dragon can wipe away boards and really save us. I think that what goes really well with all of these planeswalkers, besides the doubling season you see next to it, is extra turn spells. Capture of Jingzhou, Time Warp, Temporal Manipulation, and Expropriate all give us extra turns, which give us extra activations, and really gives us more time to develop our defenses. Eventually, as this game comes to a close, we're going to want extra turns to be able to use our overwhelming creature advantage to kill our opponents. Next up, we have the card I just mentioned because it's so good with all of these. It's Doubling Season. It doubles up your planeswalkers, and especially those planeswalkers that create tokens, that flood the board with tokens. We're going to have a little bit of a token strategy in this, and Doubling Season is just great. This goes really well with my next card or strategy, which is putting other tokens on the battlefield. First up, we have some enchantments that do it with Mobilization and Luminarch's Ascension. We're going to get into the late game, have tons of mana that we can pump into these great enchantments and flood the board. These two are also really great defensively, and that's one of the great things about flooding the board with tokens is that they block just as well as they attack in the later game. Actually, now that I think about it, mobilization and all of these tokens don't finish the game really well, which is why we would need a card like Elish Norn to really give them power. Elish Norn, featured here, covered in dog hair like everything in my house, is the Praetor's language. That's impossible to read, but I'll explain it to you. It gives all your opponent's creatures -2/-2, and all your creatures +2/+2, which makes them real threats. And that's what we want, is to turn them into real threats. Academy Rector is a great Rattlesnake card. Just pay attention to all the great enchantments we have that Academy Rector can cheat onto the battlefield. We have other Rattlesnake cards in this deck, like Wormcoil Engine. It'll gain us life, it's hard to kill, it's redundant, and it basically blocks really well. It's a great Rattlesnake to drop onto the battlefield, and if we kill it, then Doubling Season will double up those tokens. We have other tokens too, like Martial Coup, which will wipe the board, Decree of Justice, which can cycle, which is uncounterable, and both of these produce soldiers, so Knight Captain of Eos pumps out soldiers as well, and is a fog outlet on a dude. It's exactly what we want. It's tokens and it's fog. 2 more fogs on dudes. We have Spike Weaver and Selfless Squire. One thing that's great about Selfless Squire is that once it's on the battlefield, if you continue to fog, Selfless Squire continues to generate +1/+1 counters on it. And we have to include Arachnogenesis, a fog that creates tokens, exactly what we want. Constant Mist is going to play with a lot of our land matter strategy, and Teferi's Protection protects us completely. Peacekeeper is a creature that just shuts down all attacks, kind of like the moat I have here, which again shuts down so many different types of attacks. There are also some cards that don't shut down attacks completely but discourage them. Archangel of Tides taxes your opponents. Windborn Muse does the similar thing. Same thing with these enchantments, Ghostly Prison and Propaganda. All of these will discourage your opponents, and some of them will make it easier to attack, like that Archangel of Tides. We also have another couple cards that really discourage attacking. Force Field only lets you lose 1 life to an unblocked creature, and Ensnaring Bridge can shut down opponents' attacks really, really well. If you have very few cards in hand, we might have some strategies that work against that. We might like to hold some cards in our hand, but it'll definitely shut down attacks from those big fatties. And then we have a card like Drop of Honey, which systematically destroys our opponent's creatures. This does kind of go counter to a lot of our token strategy, but I think we could play around with Drop of Honey. Also not included in this deck is Periphery Nodes. I guess the reason why we included this is because Drop of Honey is so freaking expensive. Moving on to our next category, we have a little bit of disruption. Actually, Cryptic Command is kind of like a fog because it has the ability to tap down all our opponent's creatures, but it's also a counterspell. Speaking of counterspell, there's counterspell. We also have Mana Drain. We might need to answer some really big threats, and these cards will do it really well. Vendilion Click might be the exact kind of disruption that we need, and some combat damage in the air. Snapcaster Mage will let us get back all those great fogs, some of the board wipes, and Jacevin's Prodigy does something similar, getting some of these cards that we really need back again. And some of the cards we need to do to control this board has got to be like Supreme Verdict, wiping the battlefield, Wrath of God, Cyclonic Rift. We're going to have to start back to 0 over and over again because our opponents are going to gain a lot of traction. Now we have some creature ability to gain some advantage. Birds of Paradise, Azusa Lost But Seeking, and Solemn Simulacrum. All of these will help us ramp a little bit. Next up, we have a few tutors. We have Wargate, which tutors any permanent straight onto the battlefield. That includes Planeswalkers and Doubling Season and Moat. Crazy. Enlightened Tutor also can find artifacts and enchantments, and we're going to see that artifacts and enchantments are a lot of the critical cards that make this strategy really work. And also, along with the tutors, we have our Academy Rector, which I already mentioned. Next up, we have the ability to make big mana with Mirari's Wake and Candelabra of Tawnos. Mirari's Wake gives us lots of mana, but also pumps these tokens that we're putting out on the battlefield, and combined with Candelabra means that we can get a lot of recurring value and tons of mana out of these doubling abilities. And we have a lot of lands that are useful in tapping too. Let's talk about fast mana. Chrome Mox, Soul Ring, Mox Diamond, Mana Vault, Chromatic Lantern, Coalition Relic, and Mana Crypt. All of these artifacts will give us fast mana, let us establish a board, and we're able to trim down the mana base because we have so many of these, and they're expensive, so we got to include it to pump up our budget. And with so many ways of searching and cracking and shuffling, Sensei's Divining Top and Scroll Rack are going to work really great. Let's take a look at all of those fetch lands we have to help shuffle. We got every single off-colored fetch land, every single on-color fetch land, and all of them are Zendikar Expeditions. Misty Rainforest, Windswept Heath, Flooded Strand. These guys are great, and really this gives us the ultimate fixing. And we've seen many cases, double whites, double greens, double blues, all over the place. So this fixing is really going to help, including all of the off colors. Usually I don't include off color fetches, not because they're illegal. You can totally play them in Commander, but because I want to limit the amount of fetches I have. But you can see how this shuffling makes Sensei's Divining Top and Scroll Rack real good in terms of card advantage. Now I want to mention Crucible of Worlds. Being able to get these fetch lands back and then fetch more things is really great. Crucible of Worlds also plays really well with a lot of other different lands that disrupt our opponent. Remember, it's a fog strategy. We want to disrupt people at every turn, so cards like Dust Bowl and Strip Mine and Wasteland all will disrupt our opponent's ability to interact with us through their mana base. Rishadan Port can also interrupt your opponent's ability to play the game that they want to by tapping down a land. This does target a specific opponent, so this might not work in a multiplayer game as much as you'd like, but other cards like Krosan Verge and Horizon Canopy are like mixes of fetch lands and go really well with that Crucible of Worlds. We also have some other utility lands. These are going to be great in this deck. Glacial Chasm is going to shut down the battlefield almost like the Moat does. Core Haven and Maze of Ith are going to be able to untap attacking creatures coming at us, giving us extra redundancy when it comes to fogs. And we also have some other cards that can dodge board wipes. Stirring Wildwood and Celestial Colonnade, these are really strong control cards, and also if they ever die in combat, we can get them back with the Crucible of Worlds, and they're fixing too, they're just wonderful. Next up, we have 3 of the great shock lands that are cool in Expeditions. We have these Pain lands, and the only reason why we have these Pains lands and not something I like more is because they're surprisingly expensive in foil. Yeah. Okay. Next up, we have some original dual lands. Again, you can't go wrong with being able to fetch, come into play untapped, all that good stuff. And then we have a few lands that tap for any color, Mana Confluence and Command Tower. And then we have some more utility lands, so many utility lands in this deck. Ancient Tomb taps for 2, Gaia's Cradle also taps for a crazy amount, and in a token deck, Gaia's Cradle can tap for a lot. And another reason why it's in here is because it's expensive. And then we have the Tabernacle at Pendrell Vale, which is also very expensive, but then works very contrary to Gaia's Cradle in the token strategy, almost like that drop of honey I mentioned. I think we'll have the ability to play around this if we need to. Also, Yavimaya Hollow giving regeneration, and Minamo School at Water's Edge untap target legendary permanent. Oh my gosh, our commander is legendary permanent, so that lets us fog on multiple turns. Very cool. And you round it out with a handful of basics. I have foil unhinged basics here, but if you're a true high roller, I guess you need Guru lands. So this deck was kind of outrageous. It does have some interesting synergies and some interesting non-bow, but one thing I really want to make clear is that this deck isn't even that good. I know it's got a ton of powerful cards in it, but I wouldn't be surprised if it lost my $15 Rurk Thar deck. There is some correlation between the power of your deck and the money you spent on it, but it isn't 100%. And if you wield politics, then most decks will fold when it comes down to a 2v1 situation. That's what's really great about Commander. It doesn't have to be all about money. If you were disappointed that my Fog Tribal deck was impossible to reproduce, you cannot go and make this deck. I can't make this deck. I have to give a bunch of these cards back. Don't worry. I will have a Turbo Fog deck tech soon. I think it's better than this one. And obviously it's at a fraction of the cost. I just want to hype some new great stuff coming up in the future, like that fog deck. It's going to be great. I'm going to be using some partners. Oh, so good. And also I'm going to be previewing a card from Dominaria. That's coming up real soon. But most importantly, I want to thank my friend who came over and shared so many of these awesome cards with me. It was great to put them together and see what kind of crazy prices we can reproduce. And I also want to thank all of you. Thank you so much for watching. And if you like this stuff, go ahead and subscribe so you can see more.